Hi, everyone. Welcome back. It's time for another episode of PEP Talk, AASA's Education Policy Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Noelle Ellerson-Ng, and I am AASA's Associate Executive Director for Policy and Advocacy. If it's your first time joining us, thanks for tuning in. Here at PEP Talk, we cover all things that could be remotely labeled as education policy. All shows are available for download under the PEP Talk landing page on the AASA website. Looking ahead, if you have a show idea or a guest you think we should have on, shoot me a note at nellerson@aasa.org or on Twitter @noellerson. Our latest episode, which you'll hear next, is with Scott Sargrad, Vice President of K-12 Education Policy at Center for American Progress. Prior to joining CAP, Scott served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education under then Education Secretary Arne Duncan, as well as the Acting Director of the Office of School Turnaround. He joined the department in 2009 as a Presidential Management Fellow in the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, and also worked as a Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. Previously, Scott taught mathematics, coached cross-country and track and field, and was a special education instructional assistant. I enjoyed this conversation with Scott as he's been a longtime colleague and advocate for public education, for sound, smart public policy, and equity. I appreciated the opportunity to highlight the work of CAP, to discuss the work they have going on, and to see what they have on the horizon as it relates to federal and state policy, public education, and their broader policy arena. Thank you for listening. Scott Sargrad is the VP of K-12 Education Policy at the Center for American Progress, or CAP. In this role, he coordinates and oversees the organization's K-12 education portfolio, including research, analysis, policy, and public education events. Scott, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
So I'm going to dig right in because I know the number of questions that I sent you, and I know the amount of information that you stand to share with our listeners. So the Center for American Progress is always running about a dozen projects at a time and burning all of those candles at both ends. So I'm doubly appreciative of you taking the time to sit down and talk with us today. For our listeners, can you start by sharing your elevator speech on who CAP is, why the group was started, and what you're working on? And that last one, I actually want to have you answer it at two levels: CAP in general, and then CAP specific to education, because it's a group that focuses on broad areas of policy, not just education.
Yeah, that's right. And that's one of the interesting things about CAP, and one of the reasons I like what I do every day is we're a progressive policy institute, a think tank based here in DC that focuses on all kinds of different public policy issues, everything from K-12 education and post-secondary education and early childhood education to immigration policy and healthcare and economic policy and LGBTQ issues and race and ethnicity issues. So it's an exciting place that covers almost anything you could think of. And so, like you said, at any one time, our K-12 education team is working on a number of different projects, but across the institution, we're working on lots of different things. So it's a fun place to learn from a lot of really smart folks. And our main mission is really to, on the K-12 team, promote and develop and defend progressive policies that are going to help all students fulfill their potential, and with a particular focus on the impact on underserved students. So we want students to attend schools that are uniformly excellent and help to level the playing field. And that's kind of broadly what CAP is trying to do, is kind of create the policy environment for all Americans to climb the ladder of opportunity and develop those progressive policy ideas.
So we have that general lens, and so the listeners have that general lens. I've known you most of my time at AASA, and that's coming up on 12 years. We crossed paths first when you were at the Department of Ed, and my team has lots of overlap with your team at CAP, including the people that you work with, but a lot of the research and policy analysis that you put out. So I went to your website, and the official description of CAP is that you're an independent, nonpartisan policy institute dedicated to improving the lives of all Americans. So I want to dig into our little education lane and ask you to expound on how CAP's work specific to education helps shape and craft the broader policy agenda. Then I have some follow-up questions, but if you could start there, how does CAP's specific education work help to shape and craft a broader policy agenda?
So I think it's a couple of things. I mean, we work on a number of different education issues. So everything from thinking about teacher pipeline policies and whether that's how to pay teachers like professionals or improve teacher preparation and induction programs. And then we also think about pathways to college and the workforce in the K-12 and particularly the high school system. We think about how you encourage innovation at the K-12 level in lots of different ways. So we try to respond to what's happening in the world, in the education world, in the broader world, and provide research and policy analysis and policy ideas that are going to be helpful to folks at the federal and state level. So, and that's one thing that we really try to focus on is what's going to be useful to policymakers and what's going to help them do their jobs, and from our standpoint, help them craft progressive policies that are going to improve the lives of kids. So we have kind of historically done most of our work at the federal or the national level, and that's why CAP was founded really back in 2003 is to be a progressive voice for federal policy. But we've moved quite a bit to doing more state-focused work, and partially because that's where all the control of K-12 education is, at not just the state level, but the local level too. And also because of the environment we're in right now in Washington, D.C. Is not as conducive to big federal policy ideas. So we try to work directly with some state policymakers, state lawmakers, governors, folks like that about what their agenda is, what they're trying to accomplish, and figure out how our work can fit with what they're doing.
Well, and we're going to get to some of that later, so don't get to some of these questions you already know I'm going to ask. I actually want to go back to one of the questions that I didn't send you ahead of time. So when AASA works with CAP, we are in coalitions with you, and we use your research and we'll use your data. But I don't think I see CAP doing advocacy the way AASA does advocacy. Does CAP do explicit lobbying, or are you more information sharing?
We do a little bit of lobbying, but it's mostly information sharing. So we have our ideas, we do our analysis, we publish them, and we love to meet with anybody who wants to meet with us on them. We put them out there so we can get those ideas into the kind of policy bloodstream, and we do have a fairly robust kind of communications and advocacy infrastructure, but it's less of the traditional lobbying and more of press communications and in-state work and things like that. So we definitely try to get our ideas into the hands of policymakers, but it can look different ways. And it's often not about specific legislation. So frequently we'll come up with an idea, we'll do some research, and we'll want to talk with lawmakers about that, and we'll present our ideas and offer suggestions for how they might take that and use it in their context.
And to our listeners tuning in, I think the question that I just asked and the answer that you just gave might sound like, well, you're lobbying, but not quite. And I think one of the good ways to clarify that difference is CAP is a group that has an overall approach. They want to make lives better for people. And in our little education lane here, Scott's talking consistently about ensuring better educational opportunity for all students is one way to think of it. But instead of lobbying specific legislation or pushing specific legislation like we do at AASA, we will take a position on yes, no, this bill, not that bill. It has to be this way. It can't be that way. CAP does more of a big picture item. We want teacher salaries to be raised, and then you'll have the data and research to support that, and you will share it widely. And really what you're relying on is that other groups who do more explicit lobbying will use your research and find it helpful. And I think that's another way to help our listeners distinguish what might be a subtle nuance to them. Is there really a difference between lobbying and not lobbying if you are still trying to achieve an outcome? And it does matter. There is a difference here. But did I capture that subtlety correctly?
Yeah, that's a great way of explaining it. We really do try to get ideas into the hands of policymakers. And a good example is you mentioned teacher pay. We did a report last year that looked at the issue of teacher pay, and we had an idea for a $10,000 federal tax credit for teachers who are teaching in schools serving students from low-income families. And we sort of would love for folks to pick up that very specific idea and introduce legislation. But there are lots of other ways to pay teachers more and to focus those resources on the students who need them the most. So we aren't sort of too wedded to any particular policy mechanism, I guess I would say, just the way you were describing it.
Well, and just like you're not wedded to one specific policy mechanism, something you hinted at a few minutes ago is that when CAP was created, I think you said in 03, 09? When was CAP?
2003 we were created.
2003. It was really created to drive a dialogue at the federal level, but you have found yourselves, for two very good reasons, doing more in the state space. Still the same model where you're not pushing an explicit legislative priority, but helping to guide discussions for outcomes. Can you talk about what that shift to the state level has been? And you said it was for two reasons. One, there's not a stomach right now in the current environment for a large federal footprint in education. And two, even if there were a larger role for the federal government, the state is still driving almost every vehicle in the education lane. So can you talk to us about what that shift has looked like to where you are now moving a single policy, which could be teacher pay, and how it could get traction at the federal level and the state level, and how CAP can support that?
I think it's both challenging and exciting in a lot of ways. I think it's challenging because we're a DC-based organization. We're close to Capitol Hill. We're close to the White House. We have a lot of relationships there. A lot of folks at CAP come out of administrations or the legislative branch, like me. I was in the administration before this, and so we know how that works. And we have fewer relationships at the state level. There are obviously 50 states, so it's harder to have strong relationships at every one, but we've really tried to build that infrastructure here at CAP over the past few years. And it's been exciting because there is a lot of variety in what states are thinking about and a lot of different contexts that it's kind of fun to work with people in different states and different places with different things that they're focused on and different approaches to some of the same issues. So, things like whether it's teacher pay or school infrastructure or high schools, and there are some of the same fundamental issues, but they play out in really different ways. So it's exciting to dig into some of those unique contexts and figure out what the best solution might be for a new governor or a state legislator that's interested in this.
Well, that's something we've enjoyed here at AASA. We've relied on CAP for some of the data that will support the things we're trying to do federally. But then we see some of these reports with growing frequency coming out of CAP that can support state level policies. And we are happy to share with our state executives and their associations this resource that can then help them at the state policy arena. And I know they're always welcoming information and research and data that can help them. So it's been a nice 1-2 combo to share you guys with them. So we've now talked about the general framing of CAP, but you've been a little busy over there writing some papers, Scott. You're not just talking education policy. And in our back and forth and prepping for today's podcast reporting, you shared with me some of your latest goings on, all of which we had skimmed or consumed or used here at AASA. But I want to walk through 5 of them, and I want to start with one that came out last year on fixing chronic disinvestment. And for our listeners, I will try really hard to remember to link to all of the 5 documents, the 5 reports that we're going to talk about in this next section. They're worth your review. They're worth your read. But as I revisited this paper in preparation for this podcast, Scott, I got really frustrated at how much this paper was a, well, yeah, kind of commentary on the idea that it's pretty obvious. But then I was disappointed because even though it's obvious, it still needed to be written. It's still relevant. When you write papers like this, Scott, and you have to include sentences that say, states with larger recessionary budget cuts experienced a decline in testing and student achievement, or there are large differences among states in educational spending and quality, with the highest performing states tending to have high spending. One, how do you not bang your head against a wall? But how can you change a dialogue that we've been having for years? How can a paper like this be a value add?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that is frustrating, from our end too. The fact that we do have to write this paper that is, yes, it does matter when states cut funding for education, and it does matter when states spend more. But I think it's an important shift in the debate on some of this, because I think we at CAP, we as progressives have for a long time been on the defense around things like investment in education. So a lot of talk about how money doesn't really matter. It's all about how you use those resources. There's no good evidence saying that if you spend more, you're going to get better outcomes. And so we haven't been able to push for increased investment. And I think that's one of the reasons why you saw such massive budget cuts following the Great Recession, and even more so in states that once the recession mostly ended and they had higher tax revenues, they cut taxes instead of investing in things like education. So we really haven't been able to push for this increased investment for a long time. But now I think you're seeing some of the really clear results of that disinvestment with the teacher strikes and walkouts over the past 2 years, and with crumbling schools and outdated textbooks. And you're also seeing more really good research evidence about the actual impact of money in education, and that it really does matter when you spend more, particularly for students from lower income families, and you do get better outcomes regardless of what the money is spent on. So I think it's one of those things that's important to keep talking about, and it can be frustrating to feel like you're just saying things that should be obvious, but changing that conversation, I think, is really important.
So one thing I liked about this report is that it wasn't data CAP collected. Rather, you aggregated from multiple sources and were able to weave together this common narrative. The idea that this isn't just a single time disinvestment, this is a chronic disinvestment. And by relying on data from multiple sources, it becomes less of a single source issue. So everything we learned in How to Write a Paper 101, right? Multiple sources citing common or repetitive conclusions gives you some level of higher validity. So we now have this CAP paper with multiple sets of data and multiple resources talking about this need to invest in education. So how do policymakers look at this proposal, this paper that you have out? And I want you to answer in two specific contexts. How does a Kamala Harris or a Patty Murray look at a paper like this versus Senator Enzi, chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, that last week passed a budget that capped all funding at post-sequester levels? So how does a policymaker look at a paper like what we're talking about?
So I think one thing is folks like a Kamala Harris or a Patty Murray, who are more predisposed to want to invest more in education. So they can use it as some fodder for their arguments that yes, it's not just that we think schools should get more money because that's a value statement we have, which is one of the values that I think we have as progressives. But you can also say, no, it really matters for all the things that we as Americans should care about, which is, are you creating pathways to opportunity for people? Are you improving results for kids? Are you preparing people for the future economy? Those things matter, and when you have some evidence that increasing spending can add to those outcomes, then it's just an easier argument to make for folks who already want to make that argument. And then I think on the other side, it's a warning for what happens when you do disinvest. And I think one of the things that's been nice really over the past few years is that at the federal level, you haven't seen much appetite for the massive budget cuts that the Trump administration has proposed. And I think in a bipartisan way, Congress has said, no, we do need to fund education. And they're not increasing funding maybe in the way that some of us would like, but at least they're recognizing the importance of maintaining some level of federal involvement there.
So then, if we have these policymakers receiving it this way, one of the things that struck me in the paper is the parallel between the conversation in the paper and how policymakers perceive it. And I saw a parallel between the push to reauthorize No Child Left Behind into what became the Every Student Succeeds Act. Could this paper be a starting point, or maybe not a starting point, but a catalyst where we really see a groundswell in support from the grassroots to exert pressure on their policymakers at the state and federal level that they need to fix this? So when No Child Left Behind was broken, we really didn't get serious action on Capitol Hill. until there was a really constant drumbeat that the law was broken and outdated. And essentially, that gave Congress the cover they needed to make the changes that became law. Could this paper be a turning point or a catalyst towards getting more traction in getting state and federal people to invest in the Hill, but then becoming immediately more cynical when the voters say they want to see this funding increase and they give the cover to their elected officials to make those changes, making sure that these voters or constituents then don't vote those people out of office when a tax increase comes or when they see that something else had to be cut. Like, what's the role of a CAP paper in maybe being that catalyst, but also helping to ensure that people understand that there's long-term impacts when they push for these types of changes?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think we are seeing a lot at the grassroots level, at the state and local level, again, with some of the teacher walkouts, teacher strikes, the widespread protests against the conditions that schools were in particular in places like Oklahoma and Arizona. And so that kind of pressure, like you said, is really important. And maybe some of that can be brought to bear at the federal level too. When people start to realize that the federal government really isn't meeting its commitments to support education for disadvantaged students. And I think one thing that we can see too is as parents, as teachers are standing up at the state level, at the local level, and protesting the lack of investment, you're seeing changes, and you're seeing in places where they had the walkouts, additional spending for education, additional investments in teacher salaries. But at the same time, you're right. Sometimes there's a bit of a backlash to that, and not every place has had the success in raising funds. So Colorado voters voted down a big new investment in education just in 2018 at the same time that other states were approving those things. So it's a real battle.
In your last answer, you talked about how there's commonalities across states, but then you also referenced teachers. And what I want to do is turn away from the chronic disinvestment paper, which is really worth a read, listeners, and it's could be very compelling to you as you go through whatever is going on in your state legislature right now this year, but a specific issue of investment in education, which is this call to raise the salaries of teachers. And this one's fresh or hot or relevant because we've seen a lot of the teacher walkouts or the teacher strikes over what could be salary, or it's a proxy for salary. They want broader investment in education, which can help with class size or other supports or other staffing modules. I want to open this question, though, with a direct quote from the paper. Americans across the country overwhelmingly support paying teachers as the professionals they are. According to a recent New York Times poll, nearly 3/4 of U.S. adults believe that teacher pay is too low, and 2/3 support increasing taxes to raise the salaries of public school teachers. Well, dang, a quote like that makes my little education geek heart go pitter patter, pitter patter. My question to you, though, is do these U.S. adults vote for the budgets that increase teacher pay? Do they vote for the board members who will move budgets that increase teacher pay and boards that will hire superintendents that will support this adequate teacher pay? I see a strong parallel between this whole idea of the annual PDK poll where my school is good, but the nation's schools are failing, with this idea of I can agree to the idea of raising teacher pay and will even say that I support a tax increase until that policy is juxtaposed against a competing priority. So, I mean, how do we play that out? What is the disconnect? Is it with the voters? Is it with the constituents? Is it with policymakers? Is it a combination of all of the above?
Yeah, I think you're right that there is this parallel to my neighborhood school is good, and my kid's school is good, but everything else is not doing so well. And I think historically that's why we haven't seen increases in teacher salaries. It's why teacher salaries haven't gone up nationally in a really long time. But I think now you are starting to see some differences, and I think the numbers are starting to bear that out in these states that had the strikes and walkouts last year. You're seeing real increases in salaries in a lot of these places, and these are places that historically have had the lowest salaries. So I think people are starting to get fed up, and they're starting to agree to support some of these tax increases. I think it's not going to be easy. It's not going to work every time, but I think we are in a different moment right now, which is exciting.
Let me burst that bubble, though, however exciting it may be. There was polling out just late last year about how parents are increasingly steering their children away from the teaching profession. So you think about this teacher shortage, where we don't have enough teachers who aren't being paid, and it's not looking like we're doing anything to bolster the recruiting to the ranks of future teachers. So what is it about teaching as a profession that gets it treated like a JV team member, where advanced credentialing, which is required to just do your entry-level teaching work, doesn't warrant the salary and respect of other similarly credentialed fields? And how much is that a part of the obstacle here for teacher pay? So is it as much pay as it is perception? And how do we balance the two?
Yeah, I think this is a major, major problem, and I think you're identifying maybe one of the most fundamental issues facing education and improving our schools, which is we don't have a teaching profession that is a profession the same way the law or medicine or engineering or other professions are treated. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is the low pay, and it's hard to argue that teaching is a profession on par with others when teachers make a third as much as other college educated professionals. It's just not the way we show value in this country. We show value by salary in a lot of places, and if we're not going to value teachers by how much we pay them, it's hard to make the argument that it's an important profession. So some of that I think comes from teaching historically being a female-dominated profession and not being seen as one that high salaries were necessary. It's where women had to go if they wanted a job back when the public school movement was first starting, and a lot of that history is still there. So I think we really do need to change what being a teacher means, what the profession looks like, and part of that starts with professional salaries.
But if we want to push back and be really historically accurate, the first teaching jobs, the first teaching professional, that field was male until there was a push for public schools and we needed so many more teachers, and the other jobs accepted men, and the only people left to staff some of these positions were women. So yes, public school education has predominantly remained female, but at its core, teaching started out as a male-centric field as well, correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. If we go all the way back, essentially every profession was a male-centric field. I think you're right there. As public schools, like you said, the public school movement really expanded. We needed more teachers, and it really came to be a female-dominated profession, and that's, I think, had a lasting impact on how we view it here in this country.
So this is not a question I sent to you ahead of time, Scott, so our listeners know that this is an off-the-cuff question. How much of this is also the idea of I went to school so I know what it takes, which is really a disconnect, because most of us have been to the doctors and we know what it takes. But how many of us outsource educating our children? I ask this question very sincerely. I'm a traditionally certified teacher with classroom experience, and I will not teach my kids because that is hard work that I need to leave to the professionals in the classroom. So how much of that is at play here as well? And what is that disconnect? Yes, you went to school, but that doesn't make you a teaching professional. So again, why do you defer to medical professionals in a way you don't defer to or trust or empower educational professionals?
Yeah, I think some of it is the fact that everyone has experience in schools, and everyone has a lot of experience in schools, right? They're at least 13 years of education, and working with teachers, learning from teachers, and so they associate teaching with the teachers they've had, and that experience historically has been lower paid workers. So it's something that maybe takes some time to change. And I think the other piece of it is, the really unfortunate saying of those who can't do teach. That's a real view in a lot of places. Yeah. And if we can't get past that, it's going to be hard to get to a place where it's treated like a profession. Nobody says those who can't do doctor. So we really need to change the attitude towards teachers.
I will just end on that note and say ditto 100%. Because I want to get to some of the other papers you shared with me, and you gave me a beautiful segue because you talked about how the overwhelming majority of Americans have lots of experience with education because they have 13 years in the public school system. So That segues beautifully into the third paper that you shared with me, one that CAP put out, I believe last year or early this year, called Are High School Diplomas Really a Ticket to College and Work? And a lot of this report centered on the reality of inequity in access to educational resources. And what I wanted to tee off with are the two questions that were at the core of this paper. Are high school graduation requirements for a standard non-advanced diploma aligned with requirements for admission to the state's public university system? And two, are those graduation requirements aligned with college and career readiness benchmarks and indicators of a well-rounded education, one that includes coursework and other educational experience in, among other topics, computer science, engineering, health, music, and technology? And from those questions, the paper goes on to highlight the discrepancies between states. But I want to get real about there's discrepancies not only between states, but discrepancies within states, within districts, and within schools when it comes to having students leave high school truly college ready, which we've also defined here at AASA as able to successfully engage in and complete entry-level college work with no remediation. So what do we even do with the depressing findings of this report, Scott?
It's a good question, because it was kind of a depressing report to write. It grew out of some work we had done on the cost of remediation in college, and we had found that remedial coursework is costing students just in course fees alone something like $1.5 billion a year. And so we wanted to know why is this happening? Why do we have such a high rate of remediation? Why are students spending this kind of money? And one of the things we wanted to look at is, okay, well, are they leaving high school actually prepared for college level work? And we know the answer is generally no from remediation. And what we found is one of the reasons we think is that there's not a real consistent requirement for what a high school diploma means and whether it is actually a level of preparation that would get you ready for college. And so we looked at all of the states' requirements for their standard high school diploma. And in almost every state, you could complete the state's standard high school diploma, and you would not be eligible to get into your state public four-year higher education institution, which just seems crazy to us. If you were going to do...
Can you repeat that, Scott? Repeat that one finding again. In how many states?
So in 46 of the 50 states, the standard high school diploma would not be enough to get you admitted to the state system of four-year higher education.
That is mind-boggling.
It is mind-boggling, and it really is an example of the lack of alignment between our K-12 and post-secondary systems. Because in a lot of states, it wasn't a huge difference. In some states, you didn't have to take the right number of years of math or of science or the right math courses, which is a pretty big disconnect. But in some places, it was, you didn't have the high school requirements were just off by the number of years of foreign language you had to take. It doesn't seem like it should be a big deal. And probably students who are going to go to college will have ended up taking what they need to take, but not every student. And it provides an additional advantage to students who have the kind of college counseling or supports at home that they need to understand that they're going to need these additional requirements.
Well, and that's the equity piece that CAP focuses on, or in this paper, it's not just about the diploma. The paper is actually about the inequity in access to educational resources, which could be the parents who can help you navigate whether or not, or the school counselor that can help you navigate whether or not what's being required of you gets you ready for what you want to do. And then even outside of just being able to identify if you have everything that you need, if you identify that you don't have what you need, which apparently is the case in 46 states, getting the resources to close that gap, whether that's just making sure you sign up for a different course or a different type of course, or you take an additional academic enrichment, either a program or a counseling or a tutoring outside of school. That's a huge equity issue at the center of this.
That's exactly right. And when you have counselor ratios, student-to-counselor ratios that are in the hundreds, it's really hard to make sure that every student is getting the access to supports that they need. And so that's why one of our key recommendations is that states really should just make the sort of college and career preparatory curriculum the standard for everyone. If you get a high school diploma in your state, you should be eligible to go to the four-year college if you want to do that. You should be eligible to go into the workforce if you want to do that. You should be ready for an apprenticeship or ready for additional training, and that should be the expectation. And maybe not everybody's going to do both of those things, but all students should have that option.
And that's what everyone should aim for. And this is where, when I put our superintendent's hat on, this is where we start to get into some of the 2008 regulations around high school graduation rates, because that is a really good standard, and that is what a diploma should get you. It should get you out of high school, but also demonstrate that you're ready for the next step, whatever your post-secondary opportunity is. But we need to be realistic. Not every child will either want to pursue that, or maybe not every child will be able to achieve that. And so with my special educator hat on, we have some students for whom that might not be ultimately what they're able to accomplish. But that doesn't mean we don't make that the goal and scaffold on our way to there. Better to have a higher standard than to water it down and have an artificially high rate of students who have a credential, but that credential doesn't carry water. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
One thing you said that I want to push back on is that this is something states can do. Totally agree that this is something states can do, but our listeners here at AASA are local superintendents. So what can superintendents do to address this in their district? Apart from the obvious thing of work with your state to ensure that your standards are aligned so that we're not one of the 46 states, make it meaningful, make it relevant, make it something they can bite off and have a reasonable shot of doing this year with their board. What can a soup do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a couple of things. One is make sure that at a minimum, your district's high school diploma requirements match that college and career readiness set of courses. So most states allow districts to add on beyond the statewide requirements. So districts should be ensuring that for their diplomas, they're ensuring that students have what they need to be successful. And then I think the other thing is making sure that there are resources, like we were talking about, for every student to access those courses that are going to prepare them for success. So that means thinking about your K through 8 system, and if one of the things you want to make sure is that every student is completing, say, Algebra 2 to graduate from high school, is that do you have the supports in place in K-8 to get every 8th grader ready for Algebra 1? And
exactly.
so I think that kind of work that superintendents can do is making sure that they have equitable access to all those kinds of opportunities for every student in their district.
Okay, so the soup does that at their local level to share with their board. What can the superintendent do with their state association? So this is like not quite state level, but what can superintendents do with their state association as a professional group to help nudge not only the collective work of what they might be doing locally, but to move the needle at the state level?
Yeah, I think superintendents have a lot of power. I think when they get together and they say, this is what we are doing for our kids, this is what we think everybody in the state should be doing, I think they can have real influence on what state lawmakers decide to do. And so if they say, no, this is the standard that we want to hold for our kids, and we think the state as a whole should get there too, I think that kind of advocacy push can be really powerful. And I think they're not just on the requirements side, but on the funding and resources side, kind of back to what we were talking about earlier. I think none of these resources and supports, and whether it's of additional tutoring for kids who are falling behind, more counselors, they cost money, and we should be transparent about that. But that means that we need to advocate for the resources that are going to provide those types of supports.
Well, and this goes back to something we talked about a few minutes ago. You need to remember when you go to the voting booth what your superintendent did, what your state association did, what these members of your state legislature did. Maybe they frustrated you on one issue, but did they move the equity needle? Did they shore up the value of the high school diploma that your child is receiving? Cover on courageous policy action happens not only when they take the vote, but when you vote to keep them in. And I think that becomes really, really critical, especially when we go into a 2020 election year, that your vote and your voice carry a lot of weight and responsibility. So speaking of responsibility, though, one aspect of this, we've talked about getting K-12 graduates ready. There's a huge overlap in the role for collaboration between K-12 and higher ed in addressing this readiness gap. Where are the areas that K-12 and higher ed have mutual interests, and where are the areas in this discussion where it might not behoove them to work together?
I think that this area of remediation and preparation for students who are coming out of high school and entering into the post-secondary system is really critical, because the remediation is a problem that the K-12 system needs to address, but it's also an issue that the higher education system needs to address. And there are ways that those systems can work together to design the co-requisite classes, which are ways to get students in post-secondary the remediation they need while earning college credit at the same time. And so trying to develop those courses together and make sure that there are lots of ways to reduce the need for remediation. That costs colleges money, it's bad for students, and I think we really do need to address that. It is a challenge to work across these systems, though. We have, I think almost every state has some kind of P through 16 council, P20 council that's supposed to coordinate across the various education systems. But I think in a lot of places those don't function super well, or they just don't have the authority to push and make changes. And pretty frequently the K-12 system lives under the Department of Education in a state, while the higher education system might live under a separate entity. Maybe it's an independent board, or it's controlled by the governor or by a different board of education. So there can be real barriers to that coordination.
Barriers to coordination could be the byline to so many education policy issues, but that's a separate book we're not going to write today. You've had some really good one-liners in here, Scott, and I wish I was taking notes, like writing them down. So there's two more resources that you shared with me that I do want to make sure we touch on with our members, and these are definitely something I'm not as versed in, but I know our members and our listeners will care about since it hits closer to home. What do our members need to know about the two more state-centric papers that you shared with me? 11 Ways New Governors Can Lead Executive Actions and Great Education Policy Ideas for Progressives. Two caveats I need to put into here. I'm pretty sure your 11 Ways document could just be 11 ways governors can lead executive actions in education. You don't have to be a new governor for those tips.
That's true.
And second, you shared with me the Great Education Policy Ideas for Progressives. AASA supports and endorses all candidates and all policies. We are nonpartisan or bipartisan. You just happen to share one that's focused on progressives. So with those caveats, Scott, what do our members need to know about those two resources that CAP put out?
So these were kind of fun ones for us. We do a lot of big analysis, like the high school report we talked about was a 50-state analysis, looking at all kinds of state policies and finding some pretty depressing things and trying to figure out ways to fix those. What these two papers were about were really trying to come up with some newer and exciting and interesting ideas that whether it's governors or lawmakers at all kinds of levels could pick up and run with and try to get some excitement around education. So the governor's piece, we saw in the 2018 election cycle a lot of talk about education, and partially because it's a bigger state issue than it is a federal issue a lot of times, partially because of the teacher walkouts and strikes, partially just because of the levels of disinvestment you saw and the need for increasing investment. So we had a lot of new governors in particular who came into office having campaigned on improving public education in their state. And so we wanted to offer them some ideas for quick wins. Governors can take executive actions just like the president can. And so we had an assortment of ideas around lots of different policy areas, everything from school infrastructure and construction to some of these college-ready ideas to school safety to school climate and protecting the rights of all students, lots of different things that governors could do pretty quickly in their first days and weeks in office to show that they're serious about taking on improving public education. And so that was kind of an exciting thing for us to do, and I hope some governors, new and old, pick up those ideas and use them to push for public education in their state. Then the, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
And then the 7 Great Education Policy Ideas paper was another one that we wanted to get away a little bit from some of the traditional education reform policy ideas that we have been working on, other folks have been thinking about, and wanted to try to come up with some more concrete things. Things like every student should have free breakfast and lunch in school. Maybe we should just do that. That could be an important thing for reducing stigma associated with some of the free and reduced lunch programs, or just making sure that every kid is able to learn because they're coming to school, coming to class without being hungry. And things like hiring far more college counselors and students and addressing the counselor ratio, things that really can move the needle for students. They're evidence-based policies, but they're a little bit different than some of the things that we've been focused on in kind of the education reform world for a while.
And I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't point out that while these papers seem to be written for state-level policy leaders, this could just as readily be 11 ways superintendents can lead executive actions, or great education policy ideas for superintendents that might look a little different, but those outcomes or those goals can absolutely be aimed for or targeted at the district level. It's not just something that has to take hold at the state level. I mean, leadership, that's what these two are about, leadership, whether it's at the state level or, as our members might apply it, to the local level.
And that's something that was important to us, that these were going to be ideas that maybe they were focused at the state level, but they could be federal or national ideas, they could be state ideas, they could be local ideas. You can kind of scale them up or down depending on where you sit. And they're all things that we think are important for kids and important for schools.
Okay, Scott, I made you work a lot in this podcast. I asked you some pretty detailed questions about 5 different reports, which means you had to make sure you remembered the details of all 5 of them. But I have some lighter questions that I've enjoyed asking our guests, and we've now entered that portion of the podcast. So, my favorite question right now to ask all of my podcast guests who tend to skew towards edu-geeks just like me, what is your favorite edu-geek memory? Have you ever been more of a fan than an employee in a given meeting, event, or project?
So this is a great question, and I have 2, if that's okay.
Of course, the more the merrier.
So they are both from my time at the Department of Education when we were working on and then rolling out the NCLB waivers. It was one of the things that I was heavily involved in, both in the development and then the implementation. And when we announced that we were going to offer these waivers, we had a big rollout event in the East Room of the White House with President Obama and a number of state and local leaders and members of Congress. And it was just an incredibly exciting event. And it's hard to believe that there was really an event about something that seemed as kind of policy wonky as NCLB waivers with the President of the United States. So just being there with all the other folks who had worked on that and seeing the state and local leaders, the teachers and the students who were there, and we're going to get some relief from No Child Left Behind and hopefully help them move towards a better system. That was really exciting. And then I think the second one was also related to that. Probably 6 months or so later, we were doing updates on where things stood with what states had applied for the waivers, which states were getting them, how do we think this was going to go. And I got pulled into a meeting in the Roosevelt Room of the White House with the Domestic Policy Council and with Secretary Duncan, and I sort of had to fill in for a little bit and got to sort of sit at the table in the Roosevelt Room and present to the head of the Domestic Policy Council about how things were going with the No Child Left Behind waivers. And that was one of those surreal moments where it was probably not 5 years after I was a special ed paraprofessional in a high school outside of Philadelphia, and here I was sitting in the Roosevelt Room of the White House talking about these big education issues. So it's pretty amazing.
And it wasn't just dress up and it wasn't just pretend. That was your real life and you were adulting that day.
That's right.
Yeah, no, I love hearing how my colleagues and friends, what they edu-geek out over. Okay, we wouldn't be doing our job, Scott, if we were in DC in 2019 and didn't talk a little bit about what might be coming down the horizon. So a couple more questions for you. What do you expect in 2019 education and policy at the federal and state level?
So I think in terms of actual policy at the federal level, I do think there's a pretty good chance we'll see a Higher Education Act reauthorization. And so at least something to start
to the finish?
Well, I think I was going to say at least something start to move.
Okay, okay.
I think Senator Alexander and Senator Murray, they seem pretty serious about wanting to do something, and I think as we saw with AASA, when those two really get serious, and they can make things happen. So it's obviously tough in
Totally
a big
agree.
election year, but those are the two people who could really do it. So I think it's a real possibility. I think you're right to be somewhat skeptical that they'll get all the way over the finish line, but and that seems to be the big spot. And I think the other federal thing could be a push on infrastructure. It's been kind of a running joke in DC about infrastructure week kind of coming and going, and when are we actually going to do something on infrastructure? But uh, Carson Scott in the House had a big bill on school construction and school infrastructure that would be great to see some movement on that as part of a big infrastructure push. So you never know, that could be something that is bipartisan and gets some support.
Well, I think all of the edu world agrees that if two people put their minds to something, HEA under Alexander and Murray is something that we could get behind and that would have real traction. There's outside variables like Betsy DeVos and regulatory proposals she's moved that could derail it, but people would get behind and earn with very deep sincerity a Murray Alexander push. So we'll see. As for infrastructure, they're going to need to pay for that. I'm not going to hold my breath on infrastructure. I see that there will be activity, but maybe a floor vote in August as part of a broader package is what I'm hearing, but they're going to have to pay for that. So, okay.
Yeah, that one
was
is
20.
maybe even more challenging.
Right, but we have to be optimistic or else we might go nuts in this job. So,
That's right.
okay, that was 2019, Scott. 2020 is going to be a big year. The election is sure to be all the news if it's not already. What role do you see for education in 2020?
I think this is a tough one. I mean, education is not usually a big presidential election year issue. I remember back in 2008, there was the big Ed in '08 campaign to try to make it sort of a top issue for
Yep.
folks, and that didn't go so well. So I think it's hard to make education a big issue. But I do think that candidates are going to be talking about the economy and how they're going to create an economy that works for everyone and creates pathways to the middle class. And education is a core part of that. So I think you could see some candidates and folks really talking about what education means for economic development, for economic prosperity. So I see it coming in that way. And with Kamala Harris's teacher pay proposal last week, some of the candidates might start talking about education.
Talking about education and being an education candidate are two different things, but we can hope and we can try to follow. And maybe, just maybe, I think the bigger success would be if we had an education-specific question in the debate, but we're going to have to wait till 2020 to see if that happens.
That's right. We'll have to cross our fingers.
Cross them all and hold them. We'll see. Scott, I want to thank you for joining us today, for taking time out of your busy day to walk us through and spend nearly a full hour going through the broad variety of education work. And I think what's really important to keep in mind is this was just the education sector of CAP's portfolio. You guys touch on a much broader, progressive, comprehensive agenda. And so it's definitely something worth perusing on the website. So thank you again, Scott, for taking time to join us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is a great conversation. Really appreciate it.
And for our listeners, as a reminder, you just listened to Scott Sargrad, who's the VP of K-12 Education Policy at the Center for American Progress. They are a progressive think tank policy group here in DC looking to support and advance policy that advances opportunity for all people. And we're focused on the education component. You can follow Scott on Twitter at the handle Scott Sargrad, SCOTT-SARGRAD. Thanks for tuning in to this issue or edition of PEP Talk, the AASA Policy Podcast, and we look forward to you listening again.